With this lecture on the French Revolution, I aim to provide a historical summary that contextualizes other cultural discussions, such as my art history lectures. However, this momentous event really requires more than just a short summary. The American Revolution, despite its own complexity and roots in European Enlightenment ideas, was, for all intents and purposes, a war of independence, and the outcome is straightforward. The French Revolution had no such simple win or lose proposition. Even what we might think of as the basic principle of the French Revolution, the replacement of monarchy with republicanism, was not the aim of those who stormed the Bastille in July of 1789. And even if we broaden our revolutionary principle to something like socially, politically, and economically improving the lives of the French people at large, we still have to account for the extreme factionalism and the rapidly succeeding groups in power, the attempted overhaul of everyday life practices and spiritual beliefs that would have been inconceivable in the American Revolution, and of course the outcome, or really the outcomes, for France went through a half-dozen regimes before the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814. To understand the revolution, we need to understand what France was like in the Ancien Régime. The Ancien Régime is the historical name given to the political and social system of France prior to the revolution. The system of government was a hereditary monarchy in which the king ruled by divine right, that's to say, sanctioned by God and his earthly representatives in the church. The social system was largely feudal and hierarchical. The nobility, comprising the elite 2% of the population, was the class at the top of the social hierarchy. They had hereditary titles, such as duke, marquis, count, etc., that afforded them special privileges, including special treatment with regard to social etiquette and practical benefits, like holding certain positions or not paying any taxes. As the propertied class, they generally did not seek employment, but instead administered a seigneurie, essentially a fief or literally a lordship, which provided their livelihood through the toil of peasants. The French seigneurs did not necessarily have to be titled nobles. They could also be upper-middle-class individuals. Either way, the seigneurs exercised jurisdiction over their fiefs, a privilege that undermined civil rights. Under the nobility is the middle class, typically educated individuals with a profession. The proletariat class consisted of urban, low-wage earners. The peasant class, at the bottom of the social hierarchy, comprised about 3/4 of the population. As you might infer from the large numbers of land workers, France still had an agrarian economy at this time. The Industrial Revolution would come to France in the 19th century. The royal family, and particularly the king, was at the top of the social hierarchy, as well as the government, which is therefore called a monarchy. During the Enlightenment of the mid-18th century, the belief spread that the peasant class was oppressed, and that the royals and nobles were figuratively riding on their backs. Louis XV, or Louis XV, was the French king for most of the 18th century. His reign was strongly associated with an atmosphere of luxury at the Palace of Versailles. The king resided here with hundreds of members of the French nobility. Despite the luxury, which often lapsed into the decadent and even licentious at this time, the hierarchy was maintained with a strict sense of etiquette and decorum at Versailles. Social hierarchies were performed at every moment, just as actual performers were brought in to amuse and divert the privileged population at Versailles. Louis XV would not be king during the Revolution. That would be another member of the Bourbon branch of the Capetian dynasty, or dynasty of the Capets, Louis XV's grandson, Louis XVI, or Louis XVI in English. His much more famous wife, Queen Marie-Antoinette, was actually a princess of the powerful Austrian royal family, the Habsburgs. She was sent to France in 1770 at the age of 14 to marry young Louis, himself still 15 and eventual heir to the throne. Having already been married by proxy and meeting for the first time at their wedding, these strangers and virginal adolescents were expected to enter immediately into a conjugal relationship. Louis XV died unexpectedly of smallpox in 1774. Meanwhile, young Louis's father had died, thus making him king at the age of 20. Louis XVI was a reluctant king. It was a job he didn't expect to get so young, and one that he, by his own words, felt less suited for than his younger brother. Louis XVI inherited a financial crisis that, in the 15 years of his reign before the Revolution, he failed to ameliorate. The extravagance at Versailles was one problem. War was another. French power on the world stage had been severely undermined during the previous reign, and notably with the outcome of the 7 Years' War. But now, Louis XVI offered French support to the Americans during their War of Independence from 1776 to 1783. You may recognize the name of General Lafayette, who made his military career fighting for the Americans. Although a landowning marquis, he sincerely believed in the war's noble cause. Back in France, the people were not only hungry, but also overtaxed, contributing to the misery of the peasantry. They were already struggling when weather conditions affecting crop production brought discontentment to a revolutionary pitch. At Versailles, the luxury continued, but it was a bit more restrained under Louis XVI. Despite his reputation as an inept king, he had an inquisitive and sensible mind, as well as a responsible and naturally temperate, almost puritanical character. Marie-Antoinette has a more notorious reputation, but this really proves the success of the slanderers of the time. While it is true that she was much more interested in pleasures than Louis, her frivolousness is somewhat excusable, given her great youth. She was 19 when she acceded to the throne. Given her lack of sexual pleasure with her husband, apparently her poor young husband was unable to fully consummate their marriage for the first 7 years of their union, and given the temptations of the luxurious court of Versailles all around her. Waiting to become a mother, she had no function as queen, and thus amused herself with games, gambling, entertainments, and fashion. The people, especially as their own misery increased, turned against her for these reasons, and also because she was a foreigner, an Austrian in particular. Austria was one of France's traditional enemies in Europe. They alternately made fun of Louis or cursed the queen for their inability to produce an heir. By the time she had a child, a daughter, in 1778, the damage was done. Accusations of affairs, orgies, lesbianism, with crude pamphlets, cartoons, and songs, continued unabated. The people grew to hate the queen, whom they most commonly called l'Autrichienne, or Madame Déficit. In reality, her spending wasn't so much a significant cause of the national deficit as her indulgences, particularly in her younger years, had created an optics problem in a country increasingly overrun by misery that she never effectively sought to repair. The lies and rumors, often salacious in nature, spread from her enemies at court to the populace. She was accused of every vice. These calumnies had no truthful basis, but myths often tend to be more compelling than reality. With no immediate answers on how to solve the financial crisis, Louis called for a meeting of the Estates General. This legislative and consultative assembly, which was comprised of representatives from 3 different social categories, with each category styled as an estate, had not met in 75 years. Representatives of the Third Estate, which came from all classes outside the nobility and the clergy, were voted in by elections, and so there would be a general election throughout the country to prepare for the meeting of the estates at Versailles in the spring of 1789. Additionally, Louis offered the French people a chance to voice their hopes and grievances in the Cahiers de Doléances. The Cahiers of the Third Estate typically addressed the problem of privilege within the social hierarchy that benefited the First and Second Estates. Their ideas were directly and indirectly influenced by the Enlightenment, which was an 18th century humanist, progressive, scientific, and intellectual movement that called for the primacy of reason. Its ideas were circulated by scholars, philosophers, and scientists through meetings at academies, Masonic lodges, literary salons, and coffee houses, as well as in printed books, journals, and pamphlets. These ideas largely centered around investigating and explaining the natural world, and this understanding of nature itself became a kind of means for understanding human experience. Think of the basic idea, for example, that in nature we are all born equal under the law, or that human rights are natural rights. Famous French philosophers included Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau. The major project of the French Enlightenment was the multi-volume Encyclopédie, which aimed to grant people the means to inform themselves. But even this required freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and early volumes of the Encyclopédie were censored for speaking truth to power, particularly religious authority. But the monarchical form of political authority was challenged as well. In general, scientific truth was upheld over ideology. More specific socio-political goals that emerged from the Enlightenment included fiscal equality, individual liberty, intellectual and religious tolerance, equal rights, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and, like those Bostonians said, no taxation without representation. Thus, King Louis's call for the Cahiers de Doléances was like an open invitation to the Third Estate to marshal their Enlightenment ideals to institute a new social-political order. The Estates General opened in Versailles on May 4, 1789. Representatives came from all over the country. As a legislative body, decisions were made by vote, and vote was done by estate rather than by individual, thus reflecting the larger social hierarchy of France at the time. To explain, the First Estate, or clergy, consisted of 291 members. The nobility, or Second Estate, consisted of 270 members. Together they totaled 560 members. The Third Estate consisted of 578 elected members, representing about 97% of the population. Although their numbers were larger than that of the other two states combined, they would always be outvoted because the clergy and nobility allied in interests and immediately thwarted attempts at reform, most pointedly by blocking the very necessary taxation of the upper classes. Now, keep in mind that by this time, the middle class could attain considerable prosperity and even own landed properties, and the elected deputies of the Third Estate were truly bourgeois, or middle class. Almost two-thirds were lawyers. There were no artisans or peasants. Even so, the bourgeois had no desire to have their noble counterparts remain exempt from taxation. Clearly, their marshaling of Enlightenment ideals was self-serving rather than altruistic. Frustrated by the obstructionism, the Third Estate declared itself a national assembly, with authority to vote equally on legislation. This idea was championed by the abbot C.S., one of Paris's 20 elected deputies, who had written a pamphlet several months ahead of the meeting that had not only revealed these ideas before the estates even convened, but also brought those ideas to a much larger audience. Besides C.S., prominent members of the Third Estate were Danton and Robespierre, both lawyers. General Lafayette and the Count of Mirabeau, a writer and orator, were two nobles who joined the cause of the National Assembly. When Louis XVI tried to block the Assembly's entry to the meeting chambers, the members moved to an indoor tennis court, or really a tennis-like game known as jeu de paume. There, on June 20th, 1789, they made an oath not to disband until they had given France a constitution. The king was reluctant to accept their reforms, but he caved under pressure. His firstborn son and heir had died earlier that month, and Louis, though the father of 2 surviving children, including 1 other boy, was extremely aggrieved. So, the National Assembly, now the National Constituent Assembly, began the official work of constitution making, but the situation was far from settled. The French people, receiving reports from Versailles and nearby Paris and the more distant provinces, were riled up. In Paris, Camille Desmoulins, a friend of Robespierre and Danton, whipped the crowd into a frenzy on July 12th. Standing on a tabletop at a café frequented by political dissidents, he called for an armed uprising in light of the king's dogged resistance to reform, most recently manifested in his dismissal of the popular Minister of Finance, Necker, the day before. Desmoulins called for insurgents to wear red and blue cockade to identify themselves. Desmoulins' exhortations won over a large crowd. Parisians were suffering after harsh weather, and poor harvest caused a grain shortage leading to hyperinflation of bread prices. Meanwhile, salaries and production declined, and the people were starving. They were suspicious and angry at the upper classes. The king, certainly feeling wary as well, had added to this suspicion by calling in troops to surround Paris. The Third Estate feared this was a move to disband and even arrest them, sentiments that were echoed to the populace by Desmoulins. The National Assembly announced the creation of a National Guard, a bourgeois militia headed by Lafayette, who, incidentally, added white to the now famous tricolor cockade. Many royal troops defected to the Guard. The insurgents, stirred up by Desmoulins and sporting the cockade, joined the National Guard in collecting arms. They stormed the Hôtel des Invalides and collected some 30,000 rifles. Lacking sufficient ammunition, they then headed to the Bastille for gunpowder. On the morning of July 14th, 1789, the mob amassed outside the Bastille, the city's 400-year-old fortress, undeterred by its seeming impregnability. Although there were practical reasons for breaching the Bastille, the prison, because it interned political enemies, was a symbol of tyranny. With the Bastille under siege and the crowd demanding its surrender, its governor, Delaunay, invited representatives in to negotiate. But it was a tense moment, with contrasting scenes of genteel diplomacy on the interior and of the loud, obstreperous crowd on the exterior. Ultimately, the crowd breached the outer court, and cannons fired on both sides. However, Governor Delaunay was as loath to fire decisively on the crowd as he was unwilling to surrender the fortress, and sought to forestall disaster. But the enraged mob broke through the drawbridge, seized and ultimately beheaded Governor Delaunay and some of his men, and marched their heads around on pikes. When the fortress was finally stormed, only 7 prisoners were to be found. Apparently, however, the symbolism of tyranny was more powerful than the reality. The process of dismantling the entire old fortress began almost immediately. Only small sections of its foundation remain today. On the other hand, some of its stones served to complete the construction of the bridge Le Pont de la Concorde in Paris. Rather than condemn the violence in favor of peaceful proceedings, the National Assembly saw the advantage of having a rioting mob in their service. Though the mob violence is arguably inevitable, this sanctioning and even celebration of it is a pivotal choice. as if this concession to brutal violence set the tone for and sealed the fate of the unfolding revolution. Louis XVI was hunting in the forests of Versailles the day the Bastille was taken. Legend has it that, learning of the news only the next morning, the king reportedly said, "Is this a revolt?" "No, sire," answered the messenger, "it is a revolution." However, this belies historical reports that Versailles was in a panic after hearing the news on the evening of the 14th, news that set off a first wave of emigration the next day. Louis's younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, reached the French border by the 16th. In practical terms, the king recalled Necker, dismissed the royal troops, and pacified the mob by wearing the tricolor cockade at the Hôtel de Ville on July 17th. In the provinces, bourgeois militias were established, along with new municipal leaders. However, there was great unrest in the provinces as well. In fact, this moment was known as the Great Fear, because peasants feared aristocratic suppression or retaliations. Less famous but more impactful uprising resulted in the destruction of feudal charters, which tied peasants to seigneurial fiefs and justified taxes and undue jurisdiction of seigneurs. Occasionally, destruction of the charters spread to the burning of chateaux or the slaying of the seigneur or seigneurial family. The National Assembly responded to this uprising by abolishing feudal rights and privileges on August 4th. Later that month, on August 26th, the National Constituent Assembly completed its so-called Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Mirabeau, Lafayette, and Sieyès, inspired by Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, were some of the main protagonists. The declaration was finalized amidst much lively dispute. There were already factions among these early revolutionaries, and the moderates, sitting on the right of the meeting hall, thought things were going too far, while the radicals, sitting on the left, thought it wasn't going far enough. The enlightened ideas of the Declaration advanced civil rights and individual liberty. However, it was not complete. Rights of man is literal. Women were left out, although you should know this was an important time for agitation for women's rights. Likewise, the freedom of the press afforded by the Declaration allowed for some of the most direct calls for the decriminalization of homosexuality, previously punishable by burning at the stake, although Enlightenment attitudes had already caused the actual implementation of this punishment to dwindle even before the last burning for so-called sodomy took place in 1783, a case that also involved a murder. Arrests, blackmail, and exile characterized homosexual activity without resorting to capital punishment. The Declaration itself defined liberty in Enlightenment terms as the right to do anything that does not injure others. The Penal Code of 1791 would list only rape as a sex crime, and the Police Code would list only public indecency, the selling of obscene prints, and child prostitution. Homosexual acts were not explicitly mentioned and tacitly legal. However, perhaps due to the nature of gay cruising, homosexuals remained subject to arbitrary police surveillance. Repression resumed in 1792, although arrests and brief imprisonments resulted in nothing more until the Terror, when several men were subjected to legal prosecution. All in all, the ambiguity of laws and their arbitrary enforcement conspired with society's vocal repugnance for homosexuality to make leading an openly gay life, even in the rare instances where it was untouchable by law, difficult, if not impossible. Decoupling law and religion was one of the ways homosexuality, a sin, became tolerated. In general, religious freedom, a strong Enlightenment principle, was ensured by the Declaration. This was particularly pertinent to French Jews and Protestants. The declaration did not, however, abolish slavery as it existed in France's overseas colonies. However, as with the other rights already mentioned, it gave momentum to the anti-slavery movement. Moreover, the revolutionary ideas traveled, and people catch on to the message of being born equal, whether it was intended for them or not. Just as there was a peasant uprising in France, so too was there a slave uprising in the colonies. Black deputies eventually came to Paris as elected representatives and spoke of the importance of abolishing slavery, which finally occurred in 1794. All in all, the declaration signaled progress, but unrest in Paris continued along with other effects of the bread shortage. A report of soldiers dancing on the cockade at a party in Versailles inflamed the hungry populace. I have spoken of the xenophobic or really anti-Austrian hatred of the Queen, and the story circulated that Marie-Antoinette, when informed of the bread shortage, said, "Let them eat cake." However, this is not only out of character for her, but taken out of context. The quote, attributed to a grand princess, is actually recorded in Rousseau's Confessions, written well before his death in 1778, but not fully published until this time. Many historians consider it to be Rousseau's own invention, although some believe it had reached him through stories derived from a related witticism made in Louis XV's court. In any case, there was a mortal hatred of the Queen, and the scurrilous and obscene pamphlets targeting her and Louis proliferated without restraint after the storming of the Bastille. The famous March of Parisian Women on Versailles took place in the rain over 6 hours on October 5th. The National Guard, led by Lafayette, followed them. The king agreed to meet with a small group, but promised nothing. Early the next morning, the insurgents broke into the palace, killing 2 guards and placing their heads on pikes, and reached the apartments of the queen, who barely managed to escape to safer quarters. Lafayette interceded and calmed the invaders. Outdoors, the crowd clamored to see the king, and Louis XVI appeared on the balcony with his wife and the young heir to the throne. It was a tense moment, with muskets pointed at the queen. The crowd, apparently appeased for the moment, nonetheless called, "To Paris! To Paris!" Louis and Marie-Antoinette had no choice but to return with the crowd to the capital city, where they were installed with their children in the Tuileries palace. They would never see Versailles again. With freedom of the press came more newspapers of all sorts. One of the most popular was written by Marat, l'ami du peuple. It helped spread fear, anger, and the idea of violence. One of the most important changes that occurred from the rest of 1789 to 1790 affected the church. Still faced with the national debt, the Assembly decreed a transfer of church goods to the state. Though clumsily handled, the church was left without any wealth. Accordingly, bishops and priests were transformed into state functionaries who, like their secular counterparts, had to swear an oath to the Constitution. The Pope encouraged resistance. A national holiday was organized for the 14th of July, 1790. Louis XVI attended and took an oath of fidelity to the nation and to the law, but the country was extremely divided and counter-revolutionaries of all sorts abounded, notably outside France. Other notable events include the following. Dr. Guillotin proposed his decapitation machine, the guillotine, to equalize death. France was divided into 83 administrative departments, a system it still uses today to decentralize the government. The tricolor flag was adopted, still the flag of France today. The king, unhappy with the progression of events by June of 1791, accepted the proposition to flee to Holland in order to rally his forces and return triumphantly to Paris. Louis, Marie-Antoinette, and their children disguised themselves as lower-class citizens and secretly departed on the night of June 20th. They reached Varennes on June 21st, but the king was recognized and forced to return. Despite the presence of radical Democrats in the Assembly, the legislative body proved itself to be moderate by making excuses for the king's misstep. In July, when the people protested, Lafayette fired on the unruly crowd. This was the final break between the common people and the moderate bourgeoisie. The Constitution was accepted by vote on September 3, 1791. With the work of the Constituent done, a legislative assembly of 745 newly elected members took legislative power. The king, though nominally holding executive powers, was essentially reduced to a figurehead in the constitutional monarchy. The leftist factions, still a minority in the Legislative Assembly, would have preferred to see the king step down altogether. At first, France's neighboring monarchs did not know how to respond to the upheaval, but they were fearful of a revolutionary contagion. In the end, France itself declared war on Austria in April 1792. Having lost many of its top officers, France initially suffered a series of defeats to both Austria and its ally Prussia. The current French national anthem was composed at this time as a group of volunteers from Marseille marched into Paris in late July singing the song, thus baptized La Marseillaise. As pressure mounted, the treatment and safety of the royal family continued to decline. A mob first invaded the Tuileries on June 20, 1792. They forced their monarch Louis to don the Phrygian cap, symbol of liberty, to give a cry of Vive la Nation, and to drink to the health of the sans-culottes. The Brunswick Manifesto, a proclamation issued by the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Allied Austro-Prussian army, threatened violent retaliation to the people of Paris if the French royal family was harmed. Although intended to intimidate the Parisians, it unwittingly sparked a more radical phase. On August 10, 1792, an angry mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king fled to the chambers of the Legislative Assembly, but under pressure from the insurgents, the deputies quickly voted to dethrone the king. They further agreed to a new assembly elected through universal suffrage. Lafayette was forced to emigrate, and the royal family was imprisoned. The royal family endured rough treatment, but the group, including King Louis, Marie-Antoinette, 13-year-old Marie-Thérèse, 7-year-old Louis, and the king's sister Elizabeth, were initially allowed to stay together. Paris's mayoral government was falling under control of the radical sans-culottes, that's to say, the extreme revolutionaries of the proletariat class, named for their lack of upper-class-style knee-length breeches. Fearful of the foreign enemies closing in on them despite Danton's passionate plea to save the Republic, which led to some 30,000 troops leaving for the front lines, the Parisians panicked. With the prisons full of counter-revolutionaries, the enemies could arrive at any moment and free them. To preempt any acts of vengeance, radical shopkeepers and artisans invaded the prisons and killed well over 1,000 victims, roughly half of the prison population, including priests, women, and children. There were countless acts of wanton cruelty. When Marie-Antoinette's dear friend, the Princesse de Lamballe, who had been living with the royal family at the Tuileries before the invasion, was murdered, her severed head was paraded on a pike in front of the Temple prison, where the queen was goaded into viewing it from her window. The London Times posed this question: are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? A day after France's first military victory, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time on September 21st, 1792. They proclaimed the Republic and abolished royalty altogether. They further voted to remove any signs of the Ancien Régime. Revolutionary ideology had already become oppressive and pervasive. The idea of freedom now justified a new type of infringement on civil liberty. In a complete contradiction of professed belief and actual practice, private citizens policed each other, forcing compelled speech better than any government censors could, and reciting conformist words and creeds that many either didn't understand or didn't believe in. It was imperative to demonstrate adherence to revolutionary doctrine by addressing everyone as citizen, rather than by titles like Duke or Marquis. Even Madame and Monsieur were suspect. More moderate political opinions and support for the monarchy, or even for the person of the king as an individual, were silenced, both by the press that had previously fought for freedom and by private members of society who had likewise fought for the freedom to speak reasonably against the monarchical system of government while the king was still in power. Totalitarianism and ideological conformity were now bound to a nominally republican government. But what's wrong with totalitarianism when you know you're changing society for the better? Inevitably, citizen Louis Capet was put on trial. Robespierre argued for the death penalty, which was determined by one vote. The reluctant king, Louis XVI, was guillotined on January 21st, 1793, at only 38 years old. Although France's military victories had started to multiply, the coalition against the revolutionary nation grew larger, leading the convention to implement a policy of conscription. The idea of being enlisted to fight for a cause that they could barely tolerate provoked the French counter-revolutionaries, who rose up in large numbers in several territories, notably the very Catholic region of Vendée, where they were brutally suppressed. Incidentally, the young military captain Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to recapture Toulon, an important port city in the south, which had allied itself with Britain. For his success, he was promoted to brigadier general. The moderates in the convention, already much farther to the left by this time, increasingly fell under attack, with Marat calling for their execution, just as he had called for the execution of members of the clergy and nobility simply because they had benefited from the previous oppressive system. Robespierre, a member of the far-left Jacobin faction, called for an insurrection of sans-culottes. Not disappointing, the sans-culottes surrounded the convention and arrested all moderates who could not escape. At the same time, however, in early June of 1793, 60 of the départements had counter-revolutionary revolts. Charlotte Corday, a 30-year-old woman from Normandy, had sympathized with the moderate revolutionaries and believed Marat was largely responsible for their elimination from the convention. In July, she came to see Marat in Paris, claiming to have a list of enemies of the Republic. Marat, who had a skin disease and soaked in a bathtub, invited her into his bathroom office, where she killed him with a dagger. She was promptly arrested, put on trial, and executed. At her trial, she stated that she, quote, killed one man to save 100,000. But for the moment, the result of her actions was the exact opposite. Marat became a martyr of the revolution and was honored in public celebrations. More importantly, the revolution entered its most radical phase yet, known as the Terror. First, on August 23rd, the convention ordered a mass national conscription known as a levée en masse, to defeat the newly advancing foreign troops, as well as to suppress the aforementioned uprisings in Vendée, Toulon, Lyon, and elsewhere by the end of the year. On the 17th of September, a law of suspects ordered the arrest of all those who, by any means, showed themselves to be, quote, partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. A committee of public safety ensured the execution of this law, which resulted in about 20,000 additional victims in the next 10 months before the revolution ended. Among the victims was 37-year-old Marie-Antoinette, who went on trial on October 14, 1793. To her list of political crimes, the Committee of Public Safety felt the need to add wild accusations of orchestrating orgies in Versailles, sending millions of pounds from the national treasury to Austria, planning the massacre of the National Guards in 1792, and committing incest with her son. The sick part with regard to the latter is that the young boy's radical overseer must have talked him into signing an attestation of such atrocities. After being separated from his mother, his mistreatment heightened, and the boy would die of apparently natural causes by March of 1795. The autopsy report noted that his body was riddled with scars before it was tossed into an unmarked grave. Faced with charges of incest at her trial, Marie-Antoinette refused to respond, instead eliciting an emotional response by appealing to all mothers in the room. The prosecutor was forced to move on, but easily won his conviction anyway. The former queen, expecting life imprisonment, was instead sentenced to death for high treason due to her intelligence activities in the interest of the enemy. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, she composed a final letter to her sister-in-law, who never received it. Elizabeth's own fate was to be executed as the Reign of Terror was reaching its height in May of 1794. Marie-Antoinette's executioners entered her prison cell at the Conciergerie later in the morning on October 16th. She was forced to change her clothes in front of the guards and was made to wear a plain white dress rather than the black dress she preferred. Her hair was shorn, her hands were bound behind her back, and she was led by a rope leash. While her husband had been led to the scaffold in a carriage, she was placed in an open cart for her 1-hour drive to the guillotine erected at the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, thus subjecting her to the insults of the populace. Although she reportedly maintained her dignity, she accidentally stepped on her executioner's shoe, and her last words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The blade of the guillotine dropped at 12:15 p.m., and her severed head was triumphantly held up before the raging crowd. Just as with Louis XVI, she was buried with her head between her legs in a common grave and her casket covered with lime. The convention, purged of its moderate members, further radicalized in other ways. First, a revolutionary calendar was created by 1793. It not only reordered the weeks and months, like the Germinal pictured here, but also years. The start of year 1 was post-dated to September 22nd, 1792. Antipathy for the Catholic Church grew. Churches were closed and sacred objects were seized. This was accompanied by a popular destructive iconoclasm, and stone heads of centuries-old statues toppled as easily as flesh and blood heads. For this reason, the statues in the portals of many French cathedrals, such as Notre Dame in Paris, have restored parts. Elsewhere in Paris, the newly built Church of Sainte Geneviève had been reconceived as a temple to liberty, on the model of the Pantheon in Rome. Subsequently filled with statues, and often the mortal remains, of France's great men, it became the Panthéon we know today. In an attempt to replace Catholic worship with a republican cult of reason, Notre Dame was rededicated in 1793 to this cult. Although the convention reaffirmed freedom of worship by December of 1793, Robespierre encouraged the worship of a supreme being rather than the traditional Christian God. The iconoclasm targeted images of monarchy as well. Rebels pulled down royal statues without a second thought for conservation and posterity. A convention member proposed that, to commemorate the first anniversary of the taking of the Tuileries on August 10, 1792, the royal mausoleum at Saint-Denis be destroyed. In August, several bodies were exhumed, although the majority of the royal remains were taken out in October of 1793. They were thrown into two common graves in the cemetery by the Basilica of Saint-Denis and covered with quicklime. Alexandre le Noir managed to save the most important of the historic statues and gisants, or recumbent tomb effigies, by sending them to Paris to be exhibited in the National Museum of French Monuments, formerly a convent. Faced with so much death and destruction, even some of the most committed Jacobins like Danton and Desmoulins began to protest. They were promptly put on trial and executed in April 1794. But Robespierre couldn't stop making arrests and making enemies. Even the sans-culottes lost some confidence in him. Festivals in honor of the Supreme Being made clear that what Robespierre really wanted was a kind of worship of himself alone, since it appealed neither to atheists nor Christians. A majority of deputies finally turned against Robespierre in July of 1794. He, Saint-Just, and 19 others were arrested and guillotined on July 27, 1794. Because this took place on the 9th and 10th of Thermidorian, year 2, by the revolutionary calendar, the new convention, arguably the first post-revolutionary government, is called Thermidorian. The Thermidorian government was replaced by the Directoire, a reimagining of the French Republic with elected representatives headed by a 5-member committee that lasted for 4 years. Despite the relative stability of the regime itself, rampant corruption in the government and the instability and division caused by factions and extreme partisanship paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat in 1799. This is another date proposed for the end of the French Revolution, although France was still nominally a republic with a strong semblance of liberal principles. When Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804, that was the end of all pretensions to republicanism. However, Napoleon's regime can be considered a byproduct or extension of the revolution, and it should be noted that, with all of Europe against him for his territorial expansionism, he fell from power in 1814. That's when the Bourbon dynasty, in the person of Louis XVI's brother, returned to rule France. This was the Restoration. It may be worth noting that the revolution was partially erased when the new king took the title of Louis XVIII. Louis's son, who never ruled and died at the age of 10 after years of abuse, was considered the 17th. Of course, the legacy of the revolution endured and sparked later uprisings and revolutions, in 1830 and in 1848 in particular. The Third Republic was established in 1870, and with the exception of German occupation during World War II, France has never adopted any other form of government. As noted, the French flag is the tricolor revolutionary flag, and the national anthem is La Marseillaise. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is, along with the 13th century Magna Carta, the 1689 English Bill of Rights, the 1776 United States Declaration of Independence, and the 1789 United States Bill of Rights, a major inspiration for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Vive la Révolution!